Imagine waking up tomorrow, making your coffee, sitting down at your desk, and discovering that the solid ground you've been standing on for the last 10 years is just, well, completely gone.
Just gone in an instant.
Right. A sudden layoff or an unexpected breakup or maybe a medical diagnosis that just shifts your entire reality in a matter of seconds. When that happens, what are the literal words you reach for to describe that terror?
That's the real question, isn't it? Because we usually treat language like it's just this, I don't know, sterile toolkit.
Yeah, like it's just grammar and vocabulary.
Exactly. But today, we aren't just looking at vocabulary. We're doing psychological archaeology. The words we instinctively reach for when we're under immense stress, when our nervous system is just utterly overwhelmed, they tell us everything about the human condition. It's not about grammar. It's about survival.
It really is. Hello, and welcome to this deep dive. If you're listening to this right now, chances are you are navigating some kind of shift in your life, or maybe you're just intensely curious about how the human mind actually processes sudden chaos.
Yeah, which we all have to deal with eventually.
Oh, absolutely. So our guiding material today is genuinely fascinating. It's a transcript from an advanced C2 level English listening practice show called Advanced Zone, and the conversation is titled Adjusting the Sails, the Psychology of Starting Over.
And I have to say, it's a brilliant text because it operates flawlessly on, like, two distinct levels. Ostensibly, it's designed to teach high-level English learners the idiomatic language of change. But if you look past that, surface-level linguistics, it is a total masterclass in human adaptation.
Yeah, the stakes for understanding this stuff are huge.
They couldn't be higher. We exist in an era of just relentless compounding change. I mean, economic volatility, technological disruption, fundamental shifts in how we even interact with each other. Understanding how to process adaptation isn't some abstract academic exercise for you, the listener. It is a baseline requirement for maintaining your sanity today.
Okay, let's unpack this, because the material begins by drawing a very hard, very necessary line between the change we actively choose and the change that is entirely forced upon us.
Right.
And I want to challenge this a bit right out of the gate because, change is change, right?
Right.
Like whether I decide to move to a new city or my landlord evicts me and I have to move, the logistical outcome is exactly the same. I am packing boxes.
Yeah.
So why does the brain process those two identical physical events so differently?
It comes down to one fundamental psychological mechanism, and that's agency.
Agency.
Yes. The feeling that you are the author of your own narrative. When you initiate a change, say you decide to go back to school or you choose to relocate, you are holding the steering wheel.
Even if it's scary.
Even if it's terrifying. Your prefrontal cortexes have the luxury of time to plan, to mitigate risks, to mentally rehearse the new reality. Your brain is operating in a state of anticipatory excitement mixed with, a highly manageable dose of anxiety.
But when it's forced upon you.
Completely different neurological event. Completely different. When you experience a forced, sudden change, your brain does not neatly categorize it as a, quote, career transition or a lifestyle adjustment.
No, it freaks out.
It panics. Your amygdala, which is the brain's primal threat detection center, it registers that sudden loss of stability as an immediate existential threat. It reacts as if there is a literal predator in the bushes.
Wow. Okay, that perfectly explains the violent language the material highlights. They tell the story of a friend who was laid off after a decade at the same company.
Right, the corporate HR event.
Yeah, and the idioms used to describe this, like very standard corporate event, are practically descriptions of a physical assault.
Yes.
He was blindsided, the news came out of the blue, the rug was pulled out from under him. Nobody actually laid a hand on this guy, yet the language implies this sudden loss of gravity and severe physical trauma.
Because from a neurological standpoint, emotional trauma and physical trauma actually share overlapping pathways in the brain.
Wait, really?
Oh, absolutely. Embodied cognition shows us that our language maps directly to our physical experience of the world. When you say the rug was pulled out from under me, you're describing the catastrophic failure of a foundational schema.
A schema meaning like your mental model of the world.
Exactly. Your brain had constructed this complex mental map of reality where that job or that relationship was solid ground. It was load-bearing. So when it vanishes instantly, the brain genuinely experiences a state of free fall.
And the term blindsided is equally visceral.
Right. It's a brutal word.
It originates in sports. referring to the blind spot in a player's peripheral vision where a devastating concussive tackle comes from. The psychological injury here isn't just the loss of the job itself, it's the terrifying realization that your internal threat detection system completely failed you.
You thought you were safe.
You thought you were safe and you were dead wrong.
Precisely. That is why this profound loss of trust in oneself almost always follows a sudden shock. Because if you couldn't see this massive threat coming, what else are you missing?
Yeah, you start second-guessing everything.
Everything. And that realization leaves a person in a state the text describes as reeling.
What's fascinating here is that specific word choice. Reeling.
Think about the physical sensation of reeling. You are staggering, your internal gyroscope is shattered, and you cannot find your center of gravity. It is a psychological equivalent of severe seasickness.
Which brings up a massive societal problem, I think. When someone is in that state of reeling, our cultural instinct is to fix it immediately with toxic positivity.
Oh, the motivational quotes.
Right. You want to slap a Band-Aid on it. When one door closes, another one opens, or everything happens for a reason.
Which is the worst thing you can say.
The text explicitly warns against this. It demands that this shock, this profound seasickness, must be validated first.
If you try to force a positive spin on a forced change too quickly, you are effectively gaslighting your own nervous system.
Gaslighting yourself.
When you are reeling, your system is flooded with cortisol and adrenaline. Your cognitive bandwidth for looking on the bright side is literally zero. The grief must be allowed to exist because you are actively mourning the death of the future you had meticulously planned.
But I have to play devil's advocate here for a second.
Please do.
We've all seen people who validate their shock and then they just stay there.
Yes, they get stuck.
They build a house in that grief. The text calls this the victim narrative. At a certain point, the universe isn't going to come apologize to you, you know? So how does a person transition from being a legitimate victim of circumstance to reclaiming their agency? How do you stop the free fall?
That is the core dilemma for anyone listening who feels trapped by circumstances beyond their control right now. And the material provides a highly effective framework for this transition through the continuation of that laid-off friend's story.
Okay, right. The guy with the decade-long career.
Yes. Before the layoff, this individual was trapped in what they refer to as golden handcuffs.
I really want to pause on golden handcuffs because it is such an insidious concept.
It's a great idiom.
It describes a situation where you are paid well, you are comfortable, you have great benefits, but you are utterly unfulfilled. You are a prisoner, but the cell is so luxurious that you can't justify breaking out.
Right. Why leave the comfortable cell?
But honestly, isn't there something to be said for stability? Like, why do we pathologize comfort? Isn't wanting to just do a 9-to-5, collect a steady paycheck, and go home to your family a completely valid life choice?
It is a completely valid choice, provided that the stability is authentic and healthy. But golden handcuffs do not represent healthy stability. They represent stagnation masked by financial security.
Stagnation?
Yes. It is an environment that provides exactly enough comfort to numb the pain of an unlived life, but not enough inspiration to provoke actual growth.
Oh, that's heavy.
And the problem is biological. The human brain is a massive energy consumer, and as a species, we are wired by evolution to conserve energy and avoid unnecessary risks.
Right, keep us safe from the saber-toothed tiger.
Exactly. Even if a situation is slowly draining your soul, if it is predictable, your brain will almost always prefer it to the terrifying unknown.
So we are fighting our own evolutionary programming. We will choose a predictable misery over an unpredictable joy.
We do it every day. And this is where the catalyst theory comes into play. The text frames the devastating layoff as a blessing in disguise.
The catalyst theory.
Right. It posits that for the vast majority of human beings, significant internal growth, the kind of growth that requires you to abandon a comfortable known identity, it will simply never occur without an external crisis.
Because the external crisis shatters the golden handcuffs for you.
It does the dirty work.
It removes the option of staying the same. You are suddenly thrown into the deep end of the freezing pool, and you are forced to figure out how to swim. For the friend in the text, he would have never, ever quit that comfortable, soul-sucking corporate job to pursue his actual passion. It took the universe essentially punching him in the face to get him to move.
The crisis restored his agency by stripping away his illusions of permanence. And what did he do with that restored agency?
He retrained in landscape design and started his own gardening business, which is wild.
A total shift.
And this is where the concept of the pivot comes in. The text says he made a complete pivot. But when I hear the word pivot, I don't think of like corporate strategy or startups. I think of biomechanics. I think of basketball.
Oh, I love this. Break down the mechanics of that analogy. Why basketball?
Okay, so in basketball, when you stop dribbling, you are allowed to pivot. But there is a very strict non-negotiable rule. You must keep one foot completely firmly glued to the floor.
Your pivot foot.
Right. That is your pivot foot. If you lift that foot, it's a traveling penalty. But with your other foot, you have enormous freedom. You can sweep around, you can feint, you can completely change the direction your entire body is facing to find a new angle to pass or shoot.
That is a remarkably precise way to visualize this concept.
Because in life, a successful reinvention is almost never about burning your entire self to the ground and starting from absolute zero.
No, that's usually a disaster.
That planted foot that represents your core values. It represents your foundational identity, your natural talents, the unchangeable things that make you who you are. For the guy in the story, maybe his planted foot was his meticulous attention to detail, or his aesthetic eye, or his deep work ethic.
Because he already had.
Exactly. But the direction he was facing, the corporate HR job, that wasn't yielding any results anymore.
Yeah.
So he pivoted. He kept his values planted, but he swiveled his entire professional trajectory toward landscape design.
And that biomechanical distinction is what separates a strategic pivot from a frantic, chaotic scramble.
Yeah.
When people panic during a crisis, they try to change everything at once. They lift that pivot foot. They abandon their core values. They try to become someone they are fundamentally not. And consequently, they lose their balance and fall over. You require that immovable anchor of core values to sustain your equilibrium while you radically alter your external trajectory.
It's such a powerful way to reframe sudden violent change. But let's shift gears a bit, because not all change operates like a physical tackle. Sometimes change is dangerously quiet.
Be true.
It doesn't announce itself with a layoff notice or a dramatic screaming match breakup. It creeps in.
The transition from the explosive to the insidious. This brings us to the fascinating distinction in the text between micro drifts and macro sea changes.
Let's start on the micro level. The material uses a very gentle, almost poetic metaphor when discussing how human relationships change over time. It notes that friendships rarely end in massive, fiery, cinematic arguments. Instead, we drift apart.
Drift apart. Notice the language there. It implies a total lack of intention.
Yeah, it just happens.
It is the slow, steady, invisible current of time, geography, and circumstance pulling two objects away from each other.
It's physics. Two friends can start out in the exact same river, flowing at the exact same speed. You're in college together, or you're working at the same entry-level job, but then, life milestones happen.
So many moves.
Right. Someone gets married, someone has a child, someone moves to a new city. These events alter the invisible currents you were swimming in. You don't harbor any ill will toward the other person. You haven't chosen to end the friendship. You were just caught in different currents being pulled gently in divergent directions.
And the fundamental insight offered here is about how we combat that entropy. When you are in the same current, sharing a dorm or sitting at adjacent desks, proximity is doing the heavy lifting for the relationship.
Proximity is doing the work.
Yes. You do not have to exert any conscious caloric effort to maintain the connection. The environment facilitates it for you. They are just there. But when the currents change, the passive approach fails. You must, as the text brilliantly puts it, start paddling harder.
Paddling harder. Meaning, when the convenience of proximity evaporates, sheer intention must take its place.
Exactly. You can no longer rely on the river to keep you together. You have to schedule the phone call. You have to buy the plane ticket. You have to explicitly carve out time in your calendar.
Which is hard.
It requires a tremendous amount of energy, which is why so many adult friendships simply fade into pleasant memories.
It's exhausting to realize that everything you value requires constant paddling. But the material doesn't stop at two friends drifting. If we connect this to the bigger picture, it scales this concept up to a terrifying macro level. We aren't just talking about individual currents anymore. We're talking about the entire ocean behaving differently.
A sea change. This is a fundamental transformation of the very environment in which you operate. The chemical composition of the water itself is altered, and the most glaring modern example they dissect is the global pandemic and the sudden, irreversible rise of remote work.
Yeah, they specifically focus on the death of a concept called presenteeism.
Presenteeism, right.
Now, for decades, presenteeism was the dominant corporate paradigm. It was the deeply ingrained belief, that a worker's value was inextricably linked to their physical visibility in the office.
But in seat equals value.
Exactly. If your jacket was slung over your chair and you were visibly typing at your desk at 6:00 p.m., you were universally deemed a hard worker, regardless of what you were actually producing.
It was a management system based on superficial optics rather than actual output. The sea change of the pandemic shattered that paradigm almost overnight. Value transitioned from physical visibility to measurable results. But what is highly intellectually honest about this text is that it does not paint this massive shift as a perfect remote work utopia. They call it a mixed bag.
It is the ultimate mixed bag.
Yeah.
I mean, on one hand, we clawed back millions of hours of our lives that were previously lost to commuting. Yeah. We gained unprecedented flexibility. But on the other side of the ledger, we gained profound psychological isolation. The boundary between the living room and the boardroom just evaporated. And most critically, the text highlights the catastrophic loss of what they call spontaneous osmosis-style communication.
Osmosis. That is how culture actually functions in a shared physical space. It's unstructured, informal information flow.
Like the water cooler chat.
Yes. It happens when you overhear a conversation in the hallway and realize two departments are duplicating work. It happens when you notice a colleague staring blankly at their monitor, clearly frustrated, and you just pull up a chair to help them problem solve. It is ambient knowledge transfer.
But when you are fully remote, ambient knowledge transfer drops to absolute zero.
Zero.
You do not accidentally overhear a Zoom call. You cannot read the body language of a room through a 13-inch screen. And the survival tactic offered here is that you must transition from relying on informal osmosis to being incredibly intentional and explicit.
Which, bringing it back to our earlier point, requires you to paddle harder in your professional communication.
And it burns people out. So I want to pose this directly to you, the listener. Think about your own daily routine right now. Have you successfully adapted to this sea change?
That's a tough question.
Are you still sitting at your kitchen table waiting for information to magically osmose its way to you? Or have you learned to explicitly state what you need, to meticulously document your processes, and to intentionally schedule unstructured creative time with your colleagues? Because if you are still trying to operate on the old rules of presenteeism in a fully remote world, the sea change is going to drown you.
And if the very ocean we navigate is prone to shifting its composition at any moment, it begs the most critical question of the modern era. What is the required skill set for the sailor? Because clearly, the old maps are useless.
Which perfectly transitions us into the concept of the metaskill. Because the material makes a highly compelling argument that traditional static hard skills are no longer the ultimate safety net they once were.
No, they really aren't. Hard skills like fluency in a specific coding language or being a master of complex financial modeling software, they're obviously valuable. But they harbor a hidden, very dangerous assumption. They assume that the environment will remain stable.
Right. They assume the game isn't going to change its rules halfway through the third quarter.
Precisely. If a new iteration of artificial intelligence can suddenly write that specific code faster or automate that financial model instantaneously, your hard skill is completely devalued overnight.
Which is terrifying.
This is why the material elevates adaptability from just a generic corporate buzzword to the status of a metaskill. A metaskill is a higher-order cognitive framework. It is the underlying software that allows your hardware to keep functioning when the external paradigm shatters. It is the ability to learn, unlearn, and transition between other skills rapidly.
So what does this all mean? Because I have a real problem with the language often used around adaptability. The text mentions going with the flow, and I had to push back hard on this. Go with the flow sounds incredibly passive. It sounds like giving up. To me, it conjures the image of a dead leaf just floating down a river, letting the current aggressively bounce it against the rocks until it disintegrates. How is passive resignation a survival strategy?
Your critique is entirely valid, and it represents the most common misinterpretation of adaptability. But the text anticipates this and clarifies it beautifully. Adaptability is absolutely not passive resignation. It is not about surrendering your agency to the environment. It is about active flexibility.
Active flexibility. Okay, we need to unpack that. How do we visualize active flexibility in a way that doesn't feel like just, surrendering to chaos?
We visualize it through the titular metaphor of the entire piece. Adjust your sail when the wind changes.
Let's spend some real time exploring the sailing metaphor because the physics of it perfectly counter that dead leaf in a river mentality.
Let's do it.
When you are captaining a sailboat, You have a definitive destination in mind. You have a port you are trying to reach across the ocean. That port represents your ultimate goal, your career ambition, your core life purpose.
And the wind represents the external environment. It represents economic downturns, sea changes in technology, global pandemics, sudden layoffs.
And here's the brutal, unavoidable truth of existence. You have absolutely zero control over the wind.
None.
You cannot command the wind to blow from the east just because your port is to the west. If you stubbornly tie your sails into one rigid position and refuse to move them, a changing hostile wind will either stall your boat completely, leaving you stranded, or it will violently capsize you.
But a master sailor does not panic when the wind shifts against them. They do not abandon their destination. Instead, they engage in active flexibility. They manipulate the sails. They pull a line here. They adjust the trim there. Through the physics of sailing, specifically a maneuver called tacking, they can actually use the energy of a hostile, contrary wind, capturing it at a precise aerodynamic angle to create a pressure differential that continues propelling the boat forward.
Yes, you are literally using the obstacle as the engine. You maintain your ultimate destination by radically altering your daily tactics. The goal remains fixed. The method of getting there is infinitely flexible. That is active adaptability. You aren't floating. You are strategically harnessing the chaos of the environment to move forward.
It is an incredibly empowering way to view adversity. However, as logically sound as this metaphor is, we have to acknowledge the massive elephant in the room.
The psychological elephant.
Exactly. If adjusting our sails is so obviously the key to survival, and if it makes such perfect logical sense, why is it so incredibly agonizing for human beings to actually execute it?
Because it hurts. Because our brains actively fight us every single step of the way. We know we need to adapt, but human psychology throws up these massive, complex roadblocks. And this brings us to the internal resistance, what the text refers to as the goo phase, and the traps of the past.
The material begins this exploration by dismantling one of the most pervasive limiting myths about change. The old adage, you can't teach an old dog new trick.
Oh, the host in the source material literally dismisses that phrase as rubbish, which I absolutely love because it is rubbish.
Total rubbish.
The text cites the well-documented phenomenon of neuroplasticity. For a long time, science believed the human brain was like clay, malleable in childhood, but completely hardened and rigid by the time you reach your mid-20s.
Set in stone.
Right. We now know that is categorically false. The brain is plastic. It is constantly forming new neural pathways, capable of learning new languages, adopting new paradigms, and rewriting its own software until the very end of life. The biological hardware for change is always available to you, regardless of your age.
So if biological capacity isn't the barrier, what is? The barrier is fear. And specifically, it is a fear tied to a profound, terrifying loss of identity.
Here's where it gets really interesting. The material introduces the metaphor of the chrysalis, the metamorphosis of a caterpillar into a butterfly. Now, we have all seen this metaphor a million times on cheap inspirational posters in corporate break rooms.
Hang in there.
Yeah, exactly. But the text digs into the actual literal biology of what happens inside that chrysalis.
Yeah.
And it is equal parts horrifying and beautiful.
It is a violent deconstruction. When a caterpillar enters the chrysalis, it does not just, sprout wings and wake up as a butterfly.
It doesn't just put on a little butterfly suit.
No, it literally digests itself. It releases highly corrosive enzymes that dissolve its entire physical structure into a nutrient-rich, completely disorganized liquid soup. It becomes
Ooh, just a formless liquid sack of raw potential. Ew.
Very ew. Inside that goo are dormant clusters called imaginal cells, which hold the genetic blueprint for the butterfly. But here is the critical part. For a significant period of time, the organism is neither a caterpillar nor a butterfly. It is entirely formless. And the text argues that psychologically, human beings are absolutely terrified of entering this goo phase.
I mean, how could you not be? When you lose your job or end a decade-long marriage or decide to completely change careers at 45, you are entering the human equivalent of the chrysalis. You are no longer the respected senior project manager, but you aren't yet the successful landscape designer.
You are just goo.
You are in that incredibly messy, uncertain, humiliating middle space where you go to a dinner party and someone asks, so what do you do? And you have to answer with a stutter.
Human beings crave solid identity. We rely on labels to understand our place in the social hierarchy. The goo phase feels like a literal psychological death. The ego is dissolving. This is why people will endure astonishing levels of misery, staying in abusive relationships or soul-crushing jobs, just to maintain a solid, definable shape.
And that desperation to maintain our shape leads directly into the second major psychological trap the text explores, the sunk cost fallacy.
Ah, yes. The sunk cost fallacy is perhaps the most powerful cognitive bias that keeps us anchored to bad decisions. It is the irrational human tendency to follow through on an endeavor simply because we have already invested time, money, or effort into it, even when the current and future costs vastly outweigh any potential benefits.
It's the classic narrative. I've spent 10 years getting this law degree, passing the bar, and building this practice. I hate it. It is destroying my health, and I am miserable every day, but I can't throw all that time away now.
Throwing good time after bad.
Right, the text explicitly calls this throwing good time after bad. It's like sitting through a terrible 3-hour movie at the theater just because you paid $15 for the ticket. The money is gone. The 10 years are gone. Why are you voluntarily paying with the next 10 years of your life too?
Because escaping the sunk cost fallacy requires accepting the loss. It requires the ego to admit defeat and to grieve the past investment. To circumvent this powerful cognitive trap, the text suggests a vital two-pronged strategy.
Let's look at the first prong, the mental reframe. The text argues that you must fundamentally alter how you view your past. You cannot view it as waste.
Never a waste.
You didn't waste 10 years in that corporate job. You spent 10 years building a robust foundation. You learned professional communication. You built resilience. You developed financial literacy. Those are modular skills. You're simply taking the perfectly good bricks from the old collapsing house and using them to construct a completely new architecture.
That mental reframe is crucial because it softens the ego's resistance. It allows you to move forward without feeling like a massive failure. But the text pairs this gentle mental shift with a much more aggressive physical strategy. Once you decide to move forward, you have to burn your bridges.
Which sounds completely counterintuitive. I mean, from day one of our professional lives, we are taught to never burn bridges.
Always keep the door open.
Always keep your options open. Always leave on good terms, just in case. So in the context of deep personal reinvention, why is the text advocating for, professional arson?
Because of human weakness. The phrase originates from historical military strategy. A commander would order his troops to cross a bridge into hostile enemy territory and then immediately command them to burn the bridge behind them.
Wow.
Why? To completely eliminate the physical option of retreat. When things get difficult, and I assure you, during the goo phase, they will get incredibly difficult. Human nature will tempt you to run back to the safety and predictability of your golden handcuffs. By burning the bridge, you enforce total, uncompromising commitment. You artificially cut off the easy route back to comfort.
You essentially force yourself to paddle harder because the shore behind you is literally on fire. Okay, so let's put this together. You've accepted that the sea change is happening. You've bravely embraced the terrifying ego death of the goo phase. You've mentally reframed your past investments, and you've burned the bridge to prevent retreat.
You're all in.
You are all in. You are now stepping into completely unknown, unmapped territory. How do you actually navigate that without being paralyzed by anxiety and imposter syndrome?
Navigating the unknown requires a complete structural overhaul of how we view learning, expertise, and career progression. And this brings us to a concept from Zen Buddhism that the text utilizes beautifully. They call it Shoshin, which translates to beginner's mind.
I find this concept so deeply moving. Can you expand on what it actually means to cultivate a beginner's mind, particularly if you are someone who has spent the last 20 years being an expert?
To be an expert in your field is a wonderful achievement, but it comes with a heavy, often unseen burden. Experts are culturally expected to have all the answers.
Right, you can't be wrong.
Consequently, experts often develop rigid cognitive filters. They filter all new incoming information through their existing paradigms. They only see what they expect to see. Shoshin, the beginner's mind, is an attitude of total openness, genuine eagerness, and a deliberate lack of preconceptions. It is the psychological willingness to look at a subject, even one you think you know intimately, as if you were seeing it for the very first time.
There's a famous quote by Shunryu Suzuki. In the beginner's mind, there are many possibilities, but in the expert's, there are few.
Beautifully said.
The text passionately emphasizes that in the modern era, specifically in the age of generative AI, where technical knowledge and hard skills are being rapidly commodified, having a beginner's mind is no longer just a cute Zen personality trait. It is a literal survival skill. If your ego prevents you from unlearning the old way and joyfully learning the new way, you will become obsolete fast.
Cultivating Shoshin requires immense humility. You have to be willing to look foolish. You have to be willing to ask the incredibly basic, seemingly stupid questions in a room full of people who might be decades younger than you.
Which ties directly into what I think is the most liberating metaphor in the entire discussion. It's a complete paradigm shift regarding how we visualize success itself. For a century, the corporate world has viewed success as a ladder. You climb the corporate ladder.
This raises an important question. Let's deconstruct the ladder. What are the inherent characteristics of a ladder?
It's straight up.
It is strictly linear. It only moves in two directions, up or down. Only one person can safely occupy a rung at any given time, making it a zero-sum game against your peers. And most terrifyingly, if you spend 10 years climbing a ladder only to realize it is leaning against the wrong wall, the only way to fix it is to climb all the way back down to the bottom in total defeat.
It's an incredibly rigid, anxiety-inducing way to view a human life. But the text suggests we completely throw away the ladder and replace it with a jungle gym. I absolutely revel in this metaphor. Think about a sprawling playground jungle gym. It is multidimensional, it is expansive.
Exactly. On a jungle gym, progress is not purely vertical. You can make a lateral move swinging sideways to a different set of monkey bars to explore a new area. You can even deliberately climb down a level to reach a much better, more secure vantage point for a future leap upward.
Yes, on a ladder, a sideways move is stagnation. But on a jungle gym, a sideways move is exploration. Taking a lower-paying job in a completely new industry so you can learn the ropes isn't falling off the ladder, it's just swinging to a new bar on the jungle gym. The material points out that deeply adopting this nonlinear mindset is the ultimate cure for the crushing anxiety so many people feel about being too late to start over or feeling behind their peers.
Because on a jungle gym, the concept of being behind doesn't even exist. There is no single summit. There is only your unique individual path through the structure. It teaches us to radically alter our relationship with time, or as the text beautifully puts it, to trust the timing of your life.
Trust the timing of your life. I love that. You aren't behind. You are just exploring a different quadrant of the structure. All of this philosophy is incredibly rich. The active flexibility of the sails, the ego death of the goo phase, the humility of the beginner's mind, the freedom of the jungle gym. But as we know, a jungle gym cannot be climbed through thought alone. You cannot sit on the playground and meditate your way across the monkey bars.
Which brings us to the final, most urgent operational directive of the material, moving from the theoretical mindset of the jungle gym into the physical reality of taking the first step.
The text delivers the ultimate, undeniable thesis of this entire deep dive in 3 simple words. Action cures fear.
Action cures fear. It is a fundamental psychological truth that human beings constantly conveniently forget.
I want to really break down the mechanics of why this works. Because when we are facing massive life-altering change, what is our default setting? We sit still, we freeze, and we think. We tell ourselves that we are planning or researching, but really we are just marinating in our own toxic anxiety.
The brain is essentially a highly advanced simulation machine. When you are sitting still, facing the unknown, your brain begins to simulate every possible catastrophic outcome in an attempt to protect you. What if I fail the certification class? What if the new business goes bankrupt? What if I humiliate myself in front of my peers?
It's paralyzing.
Fear thrives in inertia and imagination. Your imagination constructs a mountain of hypothetical terrors, and your nervous system reacts by pumping your body full of real physical stress hormones.
It's like you are paying a massive interest rate on a debt that you haven't even incurred yet. So how does action physically disrupt that biological cycle?
Right.
How does taking a step actually change the state of the brain?
When you take a physical action, no matter how microscopically small it is, you force your brain to stop simulating and start engaging with tangible reality. You send a powerful neurological signal to your nervous system that you are no longer a passive victim of circumstance. You are an active agent. Neurologically, taking a step shifts the brain's energy away from the amygdala, the fear and panic center we talked about, and channels it directly into the prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for executive function, logic, and problem solving.
It is a literal brain switch. You are physically pulling the lever from panic mode to process mode. And the text highlights this by emphasizing that you do not need to take a massive, heroic leap. You just need one small, reversible step. Sending an exploratory email, buying a domain name, registering for a beginner's seminar.
Because reality is almost never as catastrophic as our simulation machine suggests. Once you engage with the actual physical task, the brain realizes, oh, the sky isn't falling. I can handle this one small piece. And that realization builds dopamine, which builds momentum.
I want to reiterate the key quote from this section because it's the kind of sentence every listener should write on a Post-it note and stick to their bathroom mirror. Clarity follows movement. It doesn't precede it.
It is a profound inversion of how we usually operate. We naturally demand 100% clarity before we are willing to take a risk. We want a guarantee of success. But the universe does not offer guarantees. You only get clarity after you stumble forward in the dark, stub your toe, and realize where the walls actually are. Movement generates the data you need to find the clarity you crave.
Wow. We have covered a massive amount of psychological terrain today. Let's do a quick recap of the journey we've just been on. We started by examining the violent, deeply disorienting language of shock, the feeling of the rug being pulled out, the physical seasickness of reeling from a forced change that triggers our threat response.
We then explored how that terrifying shock can actually become a necessary catalyst, the external crisis that shatters the golden handcuffs and forces a strategic pivot, allowing us to keep our core values planted while changing our direction.
We talked about the insidious, quiet drifts of friendships, requiring us to paddle harder. And we dissected the massive oceanic sea changes of the modern workplace, realizing that active adaptability, adjusting our sails to use the hostile wind, is the only meta skill that will keep us moving forward.
We confronted the necessary terror of dissolving into the goo phase, the psychological requirement of burning our bridges to escape the sunk cost fallacy, and the deep humility required to embrace Shoshin, the beginner's mind.
And finally, we dismantled the rigid corporate ladder, replacing it with a multidimensional jungle gym, acknowledging that the only way to navigate it is to accept that action cures fear. Clarity follows movement.
So as we bring this exploration to a close, we want to pass the ultimate challenge from the text directly to you, the listener. What is one small, reversible action you can take today?
Just one. Please, do not try to solve the entire complex puzzle of your life this afternoon. That will just throw you right back into paralysis. What is one email you can draft? One 15-minute block of focused research you can do? One difficult conversation you can finally initiate? Embrace the messiness, step into the goo, and flip that switch in your brain.
To borrow the concluding thought from our material, the wind has already changed. That is an environmental fact you cannot alter. The only question that remains is whether you have adjusted your sails. And if I may build on everything we've discussed today with one final thought, something not explicitly stated in the text, but deeply implied by it.
Please do.
We have focused intensely on individual survival, how you adjust your sails. But if success is no longer a solitary climb up a narrow ladder and is instead a sprawling collective exploration of a jungle gym, and if the old informal osmosis of the office is dead, replaced by the isolation of the sea change, then perhaps the ultimate meta skill of the future isn't just navigating your own personal path through the chaos. Perhaps true mastery is learning how to intentionally build new structural connections on that jumbled gym, creating new ways for osmosis to happen between isolated people so that as you swing to a new, higher vantage point, you have the structural integrity to reach back and help pull others across the void with you.
That is a phenomenal lens to look through as we all figure out our next steps. Well, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. You know, when we started, we talked about how sudden change feels like stepping in the dark and missing a step, the terrifying loss of solid ground, the blueprint of your life suddenly going blurry. But hopefully, today, we've handed you a flashlight. The ground might be shifting, the wind might be howling, but you always have the agency to choose exactly where to place your foot next. Keep exploring, keep paddling, and we'll catch you on the next one.